Okay, hello. So this meeting is some time for us to have a look through these two OKRs in particular, the coordinate deploys and the changelog feature. I think both of them we have a similar sort of goal, which is they both could be quite big. So probably our goal is to work out, well, our next step is to work out how much of them, or like what's the focus for this quarter. This meeting can be general discussion and capturing of questions and things. It doesn't have to be a solution today, but certainly a chance for us to talk through things and see where we want to take them. So a little bit of background from me on number one on coordinate deploys, and then Alessio, dive in if you want to add anything. So for me, I have based this on, there's a number of epics we have kind of in the delivery backlog that cover essentially a similar problem, which is complexity of pipelines. And I think we're at the stage where removing some of that complexity will help us with other things such as rollbacks and moving into independently deploying things. So it seems like a good time to try and remove some of that complexity. I have been mostly, well, actually, no, I think Job's diagram actually summed it up better. So I won't say anything about that. So yeah, so that was kind of where I was coming out with this one is I think we have lots of ideas. And rather than, I was thinking that rather than necessarily doing like a deep horizontal dive, like we have lots of epics that say like focus specifically on independent releasing of services or deep dive into coordinating release rules in release tools, for example, or something along those lines. I was thinking that it would be nice to try and do a horizontal and something that gives some value, but also allows us to bring in some of the testing. So how can we actually make changes to our pipelines and validate them would be also a nice addition if we could find a small enough piece to fit into this quarter. Beyond that, though, I am very open for suggestions and ideas that you all have around like basically how can we make things easier for ourselves in the future. Alessio, is there anything like any other context that's worth sharing at this stage?
Yeah, I was thinking that I do agree that making it testable is something that we definitely need, but I'm not sure this is something that we can do while moving it. So what I'm thinking here is that if we take the current situation and we try to just implement testing around it, it will be, I think, a quarter effort just doing this, which will be completely wasted if we are thinking about reorganizing things around it. So what I'm thinking here is that maybe we should start tackling removing complexity, keeping in mind that we also want to be able to test the release process, but so that we can jot down issues, or if something is easy, we can start changing it, but just don't planning for it, because I think it will be a lot of work, really a lot of work. I don't know if others have ideas around this, but
I think one of the challenges also is like I'm sort of thinking we're not going to be messing with the omnibus CI configuration and their pipeline, and that's a big part of the current release process. Is like I assume for our first iteration we're going to continue to use tags to create packages to release CNG. All of this is baked into those projects CI config, and I don't know if we want to take on, refactoring that and changing it. And I think that makes it very difficult for us to kind of come up with a testing scheme.
Yeah, I was that we don't want to change all of that in one go.
Yeah,
I was thinking that the Scarbeck proposal, which is linked somewhere, but I will find it out. It's very nice because it breaks down the connection point. So it pinpoints where omnibus triggers deployer, things like that, with code references of what is happening. And so the proposal there is something like, we've wrapped this around feature flags and environment variables, whatever. So we don't remove it. We migrate and we start playing with this new architecture, and eventually later we remove it. So I think that while we are in this mixed state, we should just, I'm thinking about, we are just cutting connection where connection are triggers and moving all those new triggers back to release tools. Once we have something that is less deep in terms of chain of triggers, then we can pause a bit and think, okay, there's something we can improve here, and move on. Because something also I was thinking is that, this, as Amy said, this is really a multi-quarter effort if we want to go from beginning to the end. So I also would like to be sure that by the end of the quarter, we have the ability to change focus. So we at least we unlocked other epics or other works that we may be willing to do in next quarter, so that we don't start with a, say, 1 year long effort in refactoring pipelines.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One thing I will just say on the testing side, like, fully agree that it's a huge thing. I think as we go through and change pipelines, we should definitely be keeping in mind, like, how will we know our changes are working? Like, I think, you know, like Yurik probably talked most about the challenge of changing things and the sort of the length of that feedback cycle of having to test that at the moment with our by basically doing deploys.
Oh, there's also another thing that came to my mind when I was validating some information with Yorick before, is that we keep discussing about this pipeline as a general thing, but there, at least at the deployer level, there are two big distinctions between tagging a monthly patch, security, whatever, RC release, and auto deploy. Because auto deploy is simpler, and so I don't know, if I think in the future, so what we are doing now is that we create the stable branches out of a package that we already built, which is a previous auto deploy build. So it may be worth thinking, and I think that Yorick code is already is doing this, that the only process that we care about is the auto deploy one, and that shipping packages to customers, just repackaging something that we have already built, so that we have these things where we say, this is a package, deploy it in this environment, which is what the deployer is doing. And so maybe in this regard, then the changes between how to deploys and regular releases are minimal, so that we can still visualize everything in a release tools level. But I think it's something that is worth mentioning and thinking about, because these are two different processes, and the feedback loop on auto deploy is really short.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I think it's worth highlighting that, like, if we're gonna talk about deployments, I think it's best if we, for a moment, pretend that we don't have any self-hosted packages, and that whole process doesn't exist, because regardless of what we do to deploy to GitLab.com, that packaging process will more or less remain, maybe not the same, but quite similar. Like, we'll always have to tag, we'll always have to create changelogs and have to build packages for like 200 different distributions. So I think there also having a single pipeline, for example, would be nice, but it's less of a issue, I think, because we do it less often. Like, we don't do this every single multiple times a day. Because I think if we try to build something right now that works for both, I don't think we're going to get anywhere, because we're going to get sort of stuck because we have these two different processes with their own needs that we're trying to sort of shoehorn into a single thing. So for this case, I think it's best if we, at least for now, focus exclusively on the auto deploy side and just pretend that the packaging stuff doesn't exist for a moment.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think I would rather like fix auto deploy first and then maybe take another look at regular releases, because we have something that we know works. And also, I just think it's so much easier to iterate on the auto deploy stuff than it is if we start messing with regular releases. I'm just afraid to touch that because it's like we said, it's hard to test, impossible to test really. And it's so infrequent that, you know, I guess like, for example, with the API code changes, that was really hard because like we didn't really know it worked until we actually did the release. And I don't want to do a major refactor and have to deal with that again if we can avoid it.
Yeah, I think that sounds very sensible. Job, do you want to take us through your visualization?
Yeah, I put this together just because I kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what I'm thinking about. And also if there's anyone who thinks that like we shouldn't be doing something here, like, or if you think maybe for our first iteration, whether this is too much or if you had other ideas. One of the key differences that's illustrated here is that instead of polling for green commits from release tools, maybe we would just have the last CI job in the security project for the corresponding project trigger release tools. But I'm still kind of thinking about this. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. And that's illustrated here at the top with GitLab. So Gitly maybe would just do a version update when it has a green commit on master to GitLab, and then the last CI job would then trigger release tools, and then it would go through the full auto deploy. And then in the box over here on the left, we're having more and more projects that are deployed independently of Rails, more than you think. Like we have 5 right now, and that might grow. So I think we do need a scheme because this is quite painful for registry and CAS and these other projects. And Pages will be one of these soon, where you have to open up multiple MRs to do version bumps. So I was thinking that maybe we just have like a generic way of doing that. Can see if anyone left comments here. Yeah, talking only about auto deploys. Yeah, dedicated service, pipeline mutex. Yeah, I don't know, but is there anything here that anybody thinks that we shouldn't be doing, or maybe is too much, or is there a smaller iteration we could take?
I think it's too much.
Okay.
And so when I first looked at this, I say, okay, we are going to simplify, but where is the simplification here, right? So it took me a lot of to really.
Yeah. Okay, but what would you?
No, but you explained it.
Simplify. Yeah.
No. My point here is, so I have some follow-up question here. So, for instance, here we are talking about, I think, Kubernetes only. So I'm looking at the pages graph, for instance.
Yeah, so this assumes Pages goes into Kubernetes. Before it does, though, it'd be part of this legacy VM deployer pipeline, which is over here on the right.
Yeah, because my question here is, if we want to auto-deploy Pages, it's easier to trigger from the latest Pages green pipeline a version update, like we are doing for Gitly.
Yeah, so we could do Pages like we do with Gitly. I guess like I was thinking Pages is more similar to GitLab shell mailroom registry because it's going to be running in pods in the Kubernetes cluster, and it's sort of like a standalone service. Gitly isn't running in Kubernetes, so I don't think we have a choice there. But I thought, given the choice, why wouldn't we deploy Pages completely independent of other things? Wouldn't the development team prefer that?
Oh, sure, they will. I'm just thinking, how far are we from this? Because if it's not actionable because Pages is not running in Kubernetes. So also the very beginning, so triggering release tools from the latest merge on GitLab. Thinking about the current time here, so the time that we takes for deploying something.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a 0.0 of a first requirement, which is implementing some level of global mutex. So we need a distributed lock. While if we forget about this, so we don't change the engage point with the release, it's still we tag, and we tag with a scheduled pipeline, and we decide what we tag and where. then maybe it's easier to basically build only the release tools line, the one that is on the right.
But I don't see much of a difference between a scheduled release tools job that's looking for a green, commit versus just having a job that triggers release tools when there's a green commit, other than you have a little bit more control over the frequency, right, of the run. Like you can set the scheduled job to only run, but in that sense, like it's kind of the same to me. I couldn't really think of a difference between the two. You still have to have locking, but maybe that locking would be done at the release tools pipeline anyway, right? Like what's the difference? Do you see?
Yeah, the difference is, well, what I'm thinking here is that if you do have control over the frequency, you can just set a frequency which is long enough to do not overlap. While if you take the latest green, you may have two competing pipelines that things that get merged in sequence that they would just trigger in 2 minutes difference.
So you would have a queue that would start to build up, and then you would have to take the next thing in the queue. Whereas if you have a scheduled pipeline, you would skip over the green commits, and you would just take the latest one. So yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
Yeah,
logic.
I think if we want to start deploying basically from the source project instead of release tools, we have this frequency issue where, for example, people push to GitLab so often that if you trigger deploy every commit, you're going to have 20, 30, whatever pipelines pending. First one will run, and then basically the second one, the third one, the fourth, when you might as well just deploy the 20th one instead and save yourself 19 pipelines.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that you could just say like, okay, there's a deploy in progress. Sorry, I'll just skip and then, which would be essentially the same, right? Like you could have a trigger that would just basically be a no-op if there's a deploy in progress, and then, but yeah, maybe a scheduled. I think maybe a scheduled pipeline makes more sense. What about the other components though? Do you think the scheduled pipeline also makes sense for them, or do you think that more lends itself to having a trigger?
So I think if I look at this graph, for example, probably the first step would just be to get things in release tools. So instead of having a separate deployer, etc., we push that in one pipeline because we need that anyway, regardless of what approach we take for triggering it. I do agree that eventually we want to have a system where if you push to workhorse, we can deploy just workhorse and not everything else. Which you could do by passing an environment name.
I think that's the
components.
workhorse is never. I mean,
it's just an example. It could be GitLab shell, Gitly, whatever.
Yeah.
I think at this point, though, I don't think our components are at the stage where we can deploy essentially every commit when we push. Because even a project like Gitly that is fairly stable and self-contained, the deploy process that we have today is going to take significantly longer than it takes to push a whole bunch of commits. So we just end up piling stuff up. So I think the order will basically be get everything into one pipeline, but keep the current system where basically we decide when to deploy. Then I think we need some sort of official mutex-like feature where we can say, hey, for this, if a pipeline has this field somewhere in its CI config, only run one of them at a time. Because we have this functionality where if you have multiple pipelines on the same branch, you can skip redundant pipelines. I've never quite figured out what redundant in that context actually means, and I haven't seen it work reliably. Specifically, I've seen branches where you push, you have it on, and it will just run multiple pipelines.
You can mark them as interruptible, and if there is a new reference, they will be cancelled at any stage.
Right, and then there's the third problem that depending on your runner, when you cancel a pipeline, it won't actually immediately cancel it. Best example for Mike is if you use VirtualBox, which we don't use, but if you do, if you cancel a pipeline that uses VirtualBox, it can take 30 to 60 seconds before the job actually gets canceled, simply because VirtualBox isn't always the fastest, reasons. So if you're doing a deploy, you might cancel it. It might actually still be running, and then a new deploy starts up because in GitLab it thinks, oh, it canceled. And then you can have this thing of sort of systems trip over each other. So ideally, you don't cancel pipelines, you just make sure they never start to begin with. And I think that's a feature that's probably useful to multiple people or multiple organizations. It's one that we currently have implemented sort of ad hoc in the deployer pipeline, I believe using an environment variable. And I think once we have those two, then we can see, okay, how are we going to sort of feed release tools the data to determine what to deploy and when?
I was thinking if using resource group and dynamic pipelines, we can get exactly what we want. Because right now we have resource group, which is a key that you can put in the in a job, and every job that has that key with the same value can only run once at a time. So the first that is running, the other one are just waiting. The problem here is that because the point is that you want to make sure that you don't have more than one production deployment, but it really depends on how you build the job. So if you have a way for saying this is a production deployment, maybe it will work now that I'm thinking aloud. So I was thinking that because I remember Jarv trying this in the deployer, but he had the problem that basically at the deployer level, the deployment is spread across many jobs. But if we move this to at the triggering stage, which is here, so at release tools, we can say this trigger triggers production deployment. And so it triggers and wait. And so while that thing is running, you cannot run another one.
Yeah, this is what I was thinking. Like these trigger jobs here would have resource groups so that, and this would trigger and wait for G stage, Canary, and gprod. So yeah, those would have resource groups, so you couldn't have more than one run at a time. And I think that's one of the advantages of having this coordinator.
But I still believe that we need something external, because if
over the whole pipeline, you mean?
No, I mean, so this is not persistent. So let's say that you have some kind of problem, 4 or 503 from the checking the pipelines, whatever, and your job is killed, but the pipeline is still running. While if you have some sort of distributed log system where you say, I started this, so it's stored elsewhere. And when you run the thing again, you say, oh, wait, someone told me that there is a production deployment in progress and nobody told me that it's finished. So I would not let you start another production deployment.
Yeah.
Let's assume we can get that. Like, I think like, if we should define like kind of what behaviors we want, and then we can work out the implementation details. So that sounds sensible. What about, so Alessio, you mentioned that this looks very large. Was there other stuff that you feel like we should, or I guess for me, I'm kind of interested, what's the kind of order? Like, I think this looks like absolutely the approach, like the direction we want to go in. So what's the order that we tackle these things? Because that might help us scope it for a quarter.
I think that moving triggers outside of Omnibus and CNG should be just the first thing. So just really following what Skarbek wrote in that plan, which I think you linked or someone else linked in the agenda.
Was that the right one that I linked?
Yeah, I removed the question mark because it was the right one. I think that one seems quite, let's say, easy.
So just to be clear, like you mean like instead of Omnibus triggering deployer like it does now, we would do this tag and wait, and then once we're ready, then we would trigger deployer. So it's basically kind of like the first part of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the first part of this. But I think like if we're going to do that, I think all of this is not too complicated. Like if we still do the polling for the green commit, it's pretty much, it's just changing the CI config so that we're doing triggers from this new pipeline, right?
Yeah, but it would give us a better understanding of what we're doing, what we're missing, and
I think
move rollbacks like further down the list of things we tackle, just because I think there's some unknowns on those. Like, I think the stuff unlocks it, and maybe it's trivial later, but I think we should, I would rather not mention it in this quarter's plan, just in case it ends up we're not there.
Yeah, I think the challenge there is we need to persist the version we came from here and then re-trigger with that version. Maybe that's not too difficult. Like, we could just use an artifact or pass like CI variable for that. But
we have the deployment API. I think we can just leverage that one.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything else here that we don't like? The stuff on the left, I think, is probably not something we need to prioritize, but all of these are going to be done manually. Like right now, registry, mailroom, CAS, and soon shell, these are all deployed manually. Like, or at least CAS, mailroom, and registry, we just do version bumps. So I think the idea here was just to kind of help improve that.
Okay, so I think I wanted to discuss this in the previous part, but I didn't. So because I noticed only now. So in the right side, when you have the main release tools pipeline, you are still doing Kubernetes deployment from the deployer. So I think that step number 2 is cutting the trigger and having a stage where we at release tool to say deploy VMs, deploy Kubernetes.
Right. Yeah.
Because that piece can be exactly what we need for implementing the box on the side.
Yeah.
It is exactly the same thing.
It's the same thing. Like, basically, we have the deployer pipeline, which then triggers the K8s workloads pipeline, just like we have now, except that it's single environments, not a long chain. And that allows us to move the deploy checks and the QA into the release tools pipeline instead of having it done from deployer, which I think will be nice.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's, so basically the orange, is it orange? Is it yellow? I don't know. The yellow boxes, should be not triggered by legacy VM, but just be on the same level.
No, I think we want to keep it we want the K8s deploy to be triggered from deployer like it is now, because that's done during the fleet step, right? Like, or do you think that the K8s deploy should be deployed from release tools simultaneously with deployer, or how would that work?
How do you wait for it? I mean, because when you want to implement the box on the side where you triggers directly the K8s deployment, so why would you? Because you're thinking about the, understood. Because
basically
you need to wait for the database and everything. Yeah, but
it happens after migrations, which is done by the deployer, and we wait. Like, just like now, the deployer pipeline triggers K8s workloads, and it waits till it's completed, and then it moves to post-deploy migrations, and then it's done.
I think long term we want to split this as well, because if we want to check intermediates, because what is written here is that basically intermediate checks will still be triggered from deployer back to release tools.
Yeah.
And instead we may be willing to have the checks directly in release tools, so that it do first wave, check, the second wave, check. And so when you have this things at the deployer stage, you can trigger directly Kubernetes in the right spot.
Yeah, I think that's where we will eventually end up. It's tricky with migrations. Like, migrations would then get triggered by release tools as a separate job, I guess. And then after that, then we would trigger VMs and Kubernetes so I'm not sure how that will work, but
I think that's a future iteration, right? Like, I was thinking like that actually gets us closer to rollbacks, right? Is to actually separate those things out.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, because I'm thinking that So deployers should be kind of demoted to just apply this package to this set of machines, while release tools should get some of the information and logic about what are the steps.
Yeah, I mean, eventually deployer won't have anything to do except migrations and post-deploy migrations. And you could argue that we don't even need to use Ansible for that. We could just have that done directly from release tools. In which case we don't have any Ansible at all. Like we just get rid of it completely and everything is done from release tools. And I think we'll just gradually shift that direction. Cool. Is there anything else from this that people want to comment on?
I do have a question. It is not clear to me if we are going to get rid of the auto deploy branch and deploy from master for this coordinator, or what is the step for that?
That was my thought. I was kind of like baking that in as an assumption, but maybe we
trying
should
to sneak it in.
maybe we should just do that first with what we have, and then go here. But I think everyone kind of wants to go this direction, right?
The only concern I have about it is that what impact will that have on releases, on monthly releases, like the way we tag things? Will we have to make changes to tagging stuff?
No. So the way it works, the stable branches are created based on whatever we have deployed. The exact source differs. So for GitLab, we use the deployments feature, and the tracking of that. We basically get the latest SHA that we have in production and create the stable branch based on that. I believe for Gitly, if I remember correctly, we take the SHA that is in the Gitly server version file in GitLab, which in most cases is the same as the production SHA of Gitly, but some rare cases might not be. If, for example, we deployed something, then reverted it, but haven't deployed that yet. But that all happens, either based on the SHA or some version file in the master branch. And so it is completely detached from the auto deploy branches, has no knowledge of it in any way.
So at the moment, when we're preparing a release, we capture quite a lot of like auto deploy branch names and things like that. Like, how would that stuff change?
You mean for the monthly releases?
Yeah.
And nothing. Like monthly releases do not care about auto deploy branches at all. Like we could remove all of them today and it would continue working as you would expect.
Cool. Okay. We have the issue or the proposal to switch over to master in the planning board. So maybe it's an action for everybody to take some time to read through that and check that that looks sensible. Would this approach work without doing this first? Like, would this moving to release tools work if we were still doing branches?
I think it would. Yeah, I don't think there's any, because like finding the green commit logic would be the same as it is now, where it would just look at whatever auto deploy branch is the current one. So I would like us to move to master sooner or get rid of the branches, but I don't think we need to.
Cool. Yeah, I was just checking in case there's a unexpected blocker comes up. But yeah, I agree. Like, let's see if that makes sense to do as a first step. Did that answer your question, Myra?
Yep, thanks.
I guess I have kind of a broad question. How do we plan on visualizing these changes? Like, are we just going to add pipelines to release tools, or are we going to create some sort of app that has a wrapper that shows us all the fancy things?
Or should we generate CI with JSON it?
So I would imagine it's basically going to be part of the release tools pipeline config, but with the jobs all being optional based on whether we actually are running a deployment, etc. In other words, I think the best way is you basically take the existing deployer pipeline as it is and basically copy paste that into not quite, because we wouldn't have all the individual stage jobs, I think, but it's kind of like copy pasting from one place to another, more or less. I think probably even maybe the very, very first step is if we could somehow, I don't know if this works cross instance, if we could get the downstream pipeline to show up in release tools.
It's not cross instance because
Yeah,
everything
it's
is
all
in
in
ops now.
Yeah,
If we
that'll
move
work.
this,
Well,
it will be
the-
everything on ops, so it will work.
But the builds still occur on the dev instance.
Except for that one. But
Yeah,
you
but
wait for it.
we're not triggering that anyway.
No, we trigger it.
We
Yeah.
tag, right?
Yeah,
Untitled.
so I think the
We
point
tag
is
omnibus. Yeah.
for the other deploys, ideally, if you have this single pipeline, you would also see, here's the job on dev that's actually building the whatever. But I think, at least for a while, that's not going to be possible because we need some sort of cross-instance way of linking pipelines together. Although you could also say, let's just move dev to ops and problem solved. one GitLab instance less to worry about.
To do it
Why
before
don't we
Marin
do
comes
that?
back.
Sorry?
I think the point that I'm trying to get across with my question is that I currently struggle sometimes to find all the necessary pipelines for things. Checking for tags in the right instances, checking for the pipelines being triggered from the right places. I find that rather cumbersome. And I would love for us to try, as we work on this, to focus on the visibility impact such that we make it easier on everyone to be able to find things quickly.
This Scarback is exactly one of the reasons why we are doing this, because what we will have at the end of this is that you will have one pipeline in release tools that shows you, okay, you cannot get the downstream pipeline to the tagger, but you see something like, here I tagged and I was waiting, so you may have a link. But everything else should be visualized in the same pipeline. And now that I remember our conversation that Jerv and I had in the past, we were actually thinking of, we don't tag. So there's another point here, which is how can I find the right deployment pipeline? So the idea was that instead of, when we tag today, we tag Omnibus. And the idea was, why don't we tag release tools? So that the deployment pipeline runs on a target pipeline in release tools. So that when you want to see what deployed X, Y, Z, you're looking for that tag on release tools and you have a pipeline, which will tag Omnibus and do everything.
I like it, but Jarv has a smirky smile going on.
I'm just thinking like you would tag it, you would find the green commit and then you would tag yourself basically with that. And then that's
with
how you
information, with the SHA or whatever.
I don't know, man. Like, sure, maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
You worked out, but yeah, I do agree with you, Scarback. It's really hard to find stuff. So a solution to that would be excellent. So I think we have some kind of follow-up things to do, but as a rough scoping, we're thinking we'll somehow move the trigger to release tools. We'll build out the sort of release tools pipeline. So we've got stuff like how much of the stuff I think is to be determined. Is that it? Or are we also fancying trying some of the independent deployments as well?
I actually think we can do that in parallel or not at all initially. Like, I don't know. I think Scarback, you were working on the registry auto deploys. I'm not sure how that ties into this. Maybe we can start by thinking about how we would do this for registry, since that's probably highest priority for all these projects?
They are a little bit further out. We're working with them to get QA tests, so they probably, I mean, it might be ready sort of later in the month, possibly. Maybe it's a bit further out than that, so it might not be super soon.
I've unassigned myself from the container registry work for the time being.
Yeah. So for now, I guess those projects are just manual like they are now. We have a templated issue that kind of tells them what to do, and I think people are complaining a little bit, but it's probably okay.
Yeah, I think that's kind of fine. So I think that's probably one we can just know that in the future we can make easier. Let's not tie it into this OKR unnecessarily. And if we get to it, great. And if not, also fine. Cool. Was there anything else anyone wanted to bring up on the coordinate releases stuff, or should we move on to changelogs?
In this OKR description, we had the current state where we indicate that we're going to start triggering builds in a parallel fashion. Are we going to start triggering just specific builds, or are we going to just allow the tag, or just relying on the tags to build what they currently do today?
Whatever makes most sense. Like everything can be edited in there, so like which one would be the best approach?
Okay.
So I think that OKR in particular we can use as a kind of starting point, like completely fine to update it all. In fact, we certainly should update it all once we've worked out a little bit more how we want to frame this for the quarter, so that it's a little bit more accurate, but yeah. Cool, okay, so we haven't got all that much time left, so let's move along to changelogs. So we have a similar question, I suppose, around changelogs. Yurik has already got the epic up, but I think the question from my side really is like, what makes sense for us to tackle this quarter? Yurik, do you want to give us a bit of an overview of where you're at with this one?
Yeah, sure. So it started out basically as a proposal like, hey, let's use everything GitLab or build it in GitLab to generate changelogs. Then essentially as I started thinking about more, started thinking more about it, I realized like, ooh, wait a minute, there's a couple of things that we need to take into account. I think one of the big challenges is that the way we do releases and changelogs is very different from many other projects. In the sense that we have these YAML files right now, we concatenate them into a changelog using some API code, etc. And then we want to move to this system where ideally much of that or all of that is done for us. But then you get into these problems where we have a particular format that we want, for example, in the Markdown, which may not be the format that other people want, and so on. Through my sort of thought process, I kind of realized that if we want to keep these Markdown files, we can never fully automate this. Or put it so, we can never fully build it into GitLab, because we have this issue that these Markdown files are updated quite a bit before we tag or release, which means we need the data ahead of time. And if you have the system in GitLab where you create an API call and it will generate your changelog for you, we wouldn't have the data ahead of time, because we would have to create a release first, basically. So that kind of led me to the first question at the bottom of the epic, which is basically, do we want to keep these Markdown files, or do we, or are we willing to get rid of them? Because if we get rid of them, things get a lot easier. Because then we can, tag our release, etc. And then maybe say as part of the hey, also generate a changelog and attach it to the tag or the release, whatever. Although then you still get issues like, how are we going to present the data? because inevitably we want to group things by feature, bug, whatever. So how are we going to do that? And there's different approaches there. They're all quite difficult in the sense that I think most of them are going to require a change on how we work in one way or another. So the kind of the issue now is I'm kind of trying to figure out, okay, what are the options that we can take? Would they work at GitLab? Because I think that's also quite important. And would whatever that solution is make sense to be built in GitLab? Would other people use it? I think most enterprise users probably wouldn't, because they probably don't produce changelogs. So yeah, that's sort of the overview of where we're at now. Issue is, this is just my thought process. So I don't know if anybody else has great ideas. Or like, no, we need to do it this way. So it's kind of like what I would like to discuss a bit, figure out what we can do here, and so on.
I'm wondering if there's so our goal as it stands is to create a changelog feature in GitLab. So I'm wondering if there's a generic thing we can build which maybe doesn't fully meet all of our needs, but which we could use with some additional thing to make it meet our needs. Would that be an option?
Right. So somewhere halfway my blurb in the epic, I thought about, okay, what we can do, like building everything in GitLab based on sort of the current requirements will be difficult. But what we could do is perhaps build some sort of basic plumbing in GitLab that, for example, you could use to get the commits that might be included in a release, and then maybe their associated merge requests and that sort of thing. What I found there, though, is that we have most of the tools for that today. Like we have tags. We can get a list of commits between two tags. We have the code in place to get merge requests from a commit. I don't know if we expose that through an API. So we could use that to enrich the data with labels, whatever. And so much of our work would be sort of taping that together. But then it wouldn't be really something we'd be building in GitLab. Certainly not something that somebody can use by click button done. So kind of, it's not quite dog fooding at that point. Although I think there's sort of a trap where if we frame this purely from dog fooding, like we have to build something in GitLab that we use, I think we sort of immediately restrict ourselves in terms of what we can do. I think it's more useful if you say, okay, what is actually the problem? What do we want to solve? And can we solve that by building something in GitLab, or is the answer no? But so yeah, a very simple approach would be you create your release, and when you view a release, it will show a list of commits since between that tag and the previous tag. That is a simple thing, as in you have a list of commits, that's it. I do air quotes because it requires that given a release, we know what the previous release is according to semantic versioning. For example, if your latest release is, let's say, 14.0, and then you release 13.5.6, the previous release is not 14.0. It's 13.5, whatever came before. So that part is going to be a little tricky. Then you have your list of commits for a release, but I think that in itself is not particularly useful. That is, you can already get it. You can get the tags, figure it out yourself, and see the data. And I think the bigger problem is we kind of know what we're going to need, which is grouping things by feature, team, whatever, because we already do that. People want it. I think if we have a couple of months where we don't have that, people are just not going to be happy. And I think going from that simple first iteration to that is going to be difficult. Because, for example, commits themselves don't have enough data to group them by feature buck, whatever. So you need to either start adding tags to it or associate merge requests with them. And both have their pros and cons. Using merge requests will be easier for developers because we already use those. They already have labels, milestones, everything. The challenge there is mostly on us because given a commit, it's sometimes very difficult, if not impossible, to figure out what merge request introduced that, and thus what labels to use, etc. And the alternative is that we add that information in commits. So there's a quote-unquote standard called a conventional commit where you like prefix your commit title with stuff, and then you can use that. I'm personally not a fan of it, but if that happens to work, so be it. The issue is then that we have to require that every commit that we want to include in the changelog has to have that data. And from my experience with changing sort of the Git workflows in the past, it seems that for whatever reason, people are very reluctant to do that. They prefer to work in merge requests with a merge request and then having 15 commits that say apply suggestion to blah, for example. So it's going to require a certain amount of, how would you say, effort, I guess, that I have doubts if people are willing to do that. So it's basically the more we want to build this into GitLab, I think the more we're going to have to change how we produce the data necessary for this, and thus the more challenging it's going to be, and the more reluctant I think people will be to it. So yeah, that's sort of my blog post about the matter.
Yeah, Rick. I was looking at our CI reference recently because I was searching for something and I found a lot of new features that I was not aware of. One of these is the release generation. So seems the documentation is a bit unclear because at certain points seems to refer that you can link, you can generate a text file in the CI job, and this will be the description of the release of something like that. But regardless of how it works today, I think there seems to be a nice feature there where you say, this is a release that will tag that thing. And if that thing does not exist, then I am the job that will tell you how to generate that thing. So what I'm thinking here is that if we are, I think that if I understood correctly, we are providing a release CLI Docker image, which I think is written in Go, that is basically our reference implementation for this. So what about if we do something like that and we extend that thing to a generic collect the commit, whatever type of changelog generation, but then we have an extended version based on custom parameter or a different image that will run our currently changelog generation process. So do we still do the things with files, basically?
Right. Yeah. So like we have this Go tool, for generating releases. We could do something similar, where it spits out a changelog in a certain file format. That way, it's not really built in GitLab. It's an extra project, but easy enough.
No, my thing is that you extend the CI configuration and the base image to allow you to generate a file within the CI run, which contains the changelog. And then what you do with this is up to you.
But then you do have a couple of issues. The way I understand the releases feature is that you're running that when a tag exists, because a release in GitLab is basically a tag plus a bunch of extra stuff. So it has to run after the tag exists.
No. That's the thing that I was pointing. It says in the documentation that you can say the format of the tag, and if the tag does not exist, it will be tagged at the end of the. So that's the thing, right? Because you can say something like you put a rule based on variables, say if tag this release version is available as a variable, then run this job, and this job will tag. But the job should be run before you tag, so you can do something in theory.
Yeah, so that is an option, but that basically requires that. So we have if you have those markdown files, and we want to tag to include the necessary changelog entries, it becomes this process where we essentially have to say we want to create a release, give me all the data in it, save it, then create the release, and somehow commit those file changes back into the repository. Now, as far as I know, we don't have a way in GitLab of committing back without you having to set up, the necessary API tokens and whatever. So it's still this sort of, it is semi-automatic in the sense that it will do it automatically after you've set up a whole bunch of stuff. And that would be an option. You could in the CI config maybe specify the format of the changelog or the whatever. But then you still have the problem. Okay, what do you use as the data source? Are these commits? Are these merge requests? If they are merge requests, are they merge requests that are merged into master or some other branch? Because that wouldn't work for us, because we want merge requests that are deployed. In other words, a merge request in master doesn't necessarily mean it should be in the changelog. And then you get into problems like, okay, how are we going to deal with backports? So if we, latest is 14.0, but we tag 13.5 whatever, you'd have to know what basically the start of that range is. So 13.5, whatever patch version came before it. And so this would be easy if releases always moved monotonically forward. So if you never did backports, never did security release, every release was a higher version number, because then you could just pick the previous tag and done.
Could we focus this on just a certain thing then? Like, it doesn't have to be solve 100% of our problems, right? Like, could we just focus on something that's easier?
Well, so one approach to that is to say, okay, well, if you want to generate this data, you need to supply whatever the previous version is, because we know what the new version is going to be, and so then we can generate that range of data. But then you still have these issues like, okay, how are we going to format this, enrich it, whatever.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that if, maybe it's a bit too much of a detail, but if you do git describe -- tag, and then you give the matcher of the current structure, basically it would tell you how far are you from the previous tag in the current branch. So if we think about, even in our workflow, you always tag from something that already has a parent tag, which is the previous release. So even if you think of something more simpler, which is stable tagged on master, and then you branch off if you want to do backports, it still works, because you are going to run the changelog generation on the branch, and that branch, if you do a git tab describe, it will tell you the previous tag, basically. So the .0. And if you are a master, even if you are doing a major bump or whatever, it will still find you the previous one. But I would like to insist a bit on the generation of the changelog in CI, because I think that we have the release page, which is a feature in GitLab. So this is just my take on the problem, right? If we say that the very simple implementation is that we provide through the API the changelog within that page, so without committing it, I'm absolutely fine with it. And this can be that's the feature shipped within the product. And then because we know how this works, we could do something like, we want to trigger we want to attempt a release. So we create the changelog ahead of time with the current code, and that commit with CI rules can be the one that triggers the tagging. So basically you say if something changed the changelog, or it has some special variables, I don't know, whatever we can decide, then this is a changelog generation. So you can read the version from the changelog because you already committed it with release tools, whatever, extract the content and ship it with the with the API. And maybe the basic implementation is just, as you say, just a list of commits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so since we're running out of time, I also have a meeting after. Yeah, I would love to have whatever feedback thoughts in the epic, because then I can take a look at it sort of over more time. I think it basically begins and comes down to, do we want to keep these markdown files? Because if we do, then the releases page, we're not really dogfooding it, as in essentially mirroring the data there, but we aren't really using it. Our developers aren't really using it because they're all still working in that markdown workflow. Because if we can get rid of that, I think then we can basically do whatever we want. Then it gets a lot easier. But yeah, so thoughts on everything, welcome in the epic. I have to drop off because I have another meeting. Are there any questions or anything before I drop off?
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. So DRIs, let's try and get this stuff into epics, and everyone else can kind of comment on that. Main action I've written down is if everyone could just also take a look at the proposal to move to master instead of using branches for auto deploys. We can see if we can progress that one as well. And I will put another of these in for next week. It might not be exactly the same time because of performance reviews, but I'll try and find a time again. So fully optional for everyone, but to continue discussing how we move forward with these OKRs. And as we go into issues, I'm sure we will still need brainstorming time to tackle specific complexities as we hit them. Awesome. Good to see you all. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Take care.